read the article, get this, you have to read it carefully. That toe bone was found 16 kilometers, that's 10 miles, away from the rest of the skeleton. Do you think that toe bone was part of that skeleton? I wouldn't think so. But because of evolutionary assumptions, it's on the same layer, therefore it must be the same time period. Humans weren't around at that time period, according to evolution. Therefore, it can't be a human toe bone. It must belong to the only species that was human-like at the time. It must be cadabras. Can you see their reasoning here? It's false reasoning, but you can see the reasoning. They made assumptions based upon assumptions, based upon assumptions, based on circularity. Okay? So, moving right along. Let's take a look at Lucy, probably one of the most famous hominid fossils. And I want you to pay close attention to a couple things in Donald Johansson's book, Ancestors. Donald Johansson was the discoverer of Lucy. Notice that Lucy's left innomate, that's this hip bone right here, had been bent out of shape and broken into about 40 pieces when it was embedded in the ground. So this is the way they found it. Every fragment had to line up with the adjoining pieces from both the front and back side of the bone to convince Owen Lovejoy that he had overcome any distortion. Wait a minute. Owen Lovejoy made casts of every single piece, and then he re-sculpted them to fit his evolutionary presumptions. This is supposed to be science. I'm going to show you what he did in a minute, okay? I'm actually going to show you a video clip. You can check it out for yourself on the Nova PBS production. But get a load of this. Once Owen had restored the left side of the pelvis, he sculpted a mirror image of the right side in plaster and placed Lucy's sacrum in between to complete his masterpiece. Now, get a load of what they now do with his masterpiece. Okay? This hip bone was broken into about 40 pieces when they found it. Owen glued it back together without distortion. My first question is, how do you know it's without distortion? How do we know he did not distort it with his evolutionary preconceptions? You'll be surprised how he removed the distortion. Nevertheless, get a load of this. Australopithecus afarensis reveal a unique but constant mosaic of features. From the neck up, chimpanzee. From the waist down, human. Well, first of all, from the waist down, there isn't a heck of a lot there to go by. This piece was broken into about 40 pieces. This bone right here was found 2 kilometers from the rest of the skeleton and over 200 feet below it, stratigraphically speaking. I'm going to show you a letter straight from Neil Hansen himself admitting that. But get a load of what they do with this skeleton. When Owen brings a human pelvis, a chimp pelvis, and a cast of Lucy's pelvis into an elementary school classroom, the children have no trouble with deciding which two look alike. Lucy's pelvis has a bowl shape, like a human pelvis, but it is not as deep. And so they're convincing children that evolution is true by their distortions of reality. And I'm sorry, that is precisely what they are. For example, now, after I wrote a brief internet article as part of my newsletter a couple of years ago, got an email from Jim Foley. I had mentioned in passing that the knee joint, the knee bone, had been found 2 kilometers away from the rest of the skeleton. Jim Foley wrote me a very polite letter. He is one of the gentlemen who is one of the editors for the Talk Origins Anti-Creationist Archive. Wrote me a kind letter saying this is false, and sent me a link to a Talk Origins article. So I went to the Talk Origins article, and they had the text of this letter. This is a copy of the original letter. And in this text, Donald Johansson, the discoverer of Lucy, wrote, in 1974, Lucy was found in locality AL-288, situated some 2.5 kilometers northeast of the knee joint locality. Wait a minute. I said the knee joint was found 2 kilometers away from the skeleton. They say it's false, and then hand me a letter which tells me that the knee was found 2.5 kilometers from the locality. Confused? I was. Now, watch carefully, though. Stratigraphically, these two discoveries are separated by nearly 70 meters. Let me do the math for you folks who aren't metric. That's over 230 feet. So not only was it found 2.5 kilometers, that's, what would that be, mile and a half? Not just that, it was 230 feet lower into the sedimentary layers than this Lucy skeleton was. Are they the same skeleton? Probably not. But nevertheless, here is a video clip out of the Nova PBS series. You can check this out for yourself. This is from episode 1, In Search of Human Origins, and they actually interview Owen Lovejoy. Now, what they do here, they've got the skeleton, and Owen Lovejoy is called in because there's a problem. The knee joint looks human, the hip joint looks chimpanzee, or the hip bone looks chimpanzee. This is the bone that was broken into 40 different pieces when they found it.
Here was the skeleton of a creature that looked like it could walk like us, but with many ape-like features. The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea.
Couldn't possibly have walked upright like a human. That's the problem. They needed to walk upright.
We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later fossilization. This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's.
They fit together too perfectly. Wait a minute, if bones fit together perfectly, why would they fit together too perfectly, except it doesn't fit his evolutionary preconceptions? Watch what Owen Lovejoy does next.
But all was not lost.
He is using a Dremel to make them fit more like a human hip bone.
Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster. He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
And they actually brazenly admit this right on camera. You can watch the video for yourself. There's the reference. And in the end, lo and behold, the hip bone, which was originally broken in 40 pieces, now suddenly looks vaguely human and vaguely chimpanzee. I mean, look at this. There's huge holes left in the hip bone that before was perfect. Too perfect. What's wrong with this picture? They are now running around showing children the evidence for evolution based on this fabrication. I'm sorry, that is precisely what it is. Lucy, by the way, is right now on tour in the United States. First time that's ever happened. Okay, here's Boxgrove Man. This is out of National Geographic magazine, or a National Pornographic magazine, depending on who you ask. Boxgrove Man, I mean, look at that. That looks like a half human, half ape, doesn't it? And you see, this is the way the media works. They hire an artist to make an impressive-looking drawing that will impress upon the minds of people the profound, important evidence for evolution. This is proof. I mean, look at that. That is clearly half ape, half human, isn't it? I mean, look at it. Look at that face. However, Boxgrove Man, unless you read carefully, you won't realize this. Boxgrove Man is actually based solely on 2 teeth and part of a leg bone found in Boxgrove, England. But get a load of this. Boxgrove Man got around. The lower jaw, which was used in this, came from Heidelberg, Germany. The skull came from Bodo, Ethiopia. Are they the same skeleton? Not too likely. But again, because of evolutionary preconceptions, they had to be all from the same skeleton because that's all that was around at the time. You can see where their insanity is coming from, but it is nonsense to say the least. And this is some of the evidence presented for evolution. Anybody hear of Tiktaalik? It's big in the news recently. Okay. It's found in the Canadian High Arctic, Ellesmere Island. It was just published on last year, I think it was. They call it a fishapod. So basically, fish were supposed to have walked up onto land as part of their evolutionary ascent from the oceans to the land, and they became land creatures. And so when they found this skeleton, they got quite excited because this fishapod has big, heavy bones for the fins. Well, this is precisely what they said about the coelacanth and why it was so important, because as I showed you before, it has big, heavy bones in 4 fins. And so they assumed that this would be the ancestor of land animals. It was clearly trying to walk up on land. It had the potential, until we find coelacanths still alive today. And we get to carry out good science, and we get to observe their behavior, which could be predicted and repeated. Anybody who wants to go diving can go watch them. So are coelacanths trying to walk onto land today? Nope. They live in deep water, typically 900 feet deep. That's where they like to hang out. Are they trying to walk onto land? No. And furthermore, their spine couldn't handle it anyway. They don't have a spine. They have a notochord. But I still have heard evolutionists say, yes, but when it moves forward, it takes this fin and moves it forward simultaneously with this fin. Just like humans move their left foot forward and their right arm forward at the same time. See, they're trying to walk in their evolutionary ascent. Hogwash. This is good engineering. The reason they do that is because if they just pull this fin forward, it's going to make their body rotate. But if they pull this one forward at the same time, the two counteract each other, they move their fins forward, and they are able to swim efficiently. It's a no-brainer. But again, the evolutionary preconceptions sneak in. Tiktaalik, it's just a fish, for crying out loud. It's the same thing. Yeah, it's a strange fish. Yeah, it's got eyes on top. We've got a bunch of fish with eyes on top. Yeah, so it's got big bony fins. So does the coelacanth. So what? But yet, this has been heralded in the press as proof of evolution. Now, it's a fantastic find. Don't get me wrong. I think it's great that we go out and find these things. But to extrapolate and say this is proof of evolution is a stretch, to say the least. You're welcome to believe it. Just please don't call it science. Okay, Pakicetus. Here's another famous one, again heralded in the news. When it was first published, this is how it was drawn in a textbook. Now, the catch here is the land animals, go figure, once the sea creatures went up on land, they decided they liked it better in the water, so they evolved into whales to go back into the oceans. And that's how they explain how whales, a sea creature, are mammals. They were mammals that evolved on land, then evolved back into whales, a sea creature, okay? So what this is supposed to be a half land animal, half whale, all right? That's the principle here. So, of course, when they draw it in its natural environment. Again, it's propaganda. Nothing more, nothing less. The propaganda approach, of course, has it swimming in the ocean, merrily catching fish. Now here, if you had taken a close look at the article, here is what they found. See those dotted areas? That is what they found. That's all that they found. In other words, no, there's nothing back here, none of the body. They're missing all these white portions of the skull. That's all assumed. All of that was missing. Later on, they found more of the same skeleton. Here it is. Now, suddenly, they're convinced it was a land animal. And the only time it got wet was when it went to get a drink in the river. It didn't live in the water. It was a land animal, very much like a dog. So once again, evolutionary preconceptions sneak in. They assume it must be a whale, part land animal, because that's where evolution was at the supposed time these fossils were found. But once again, further evidence discredits it. Now, how many people have heard of the feathered dinosaurs, or the notion that dinosaurs evolved into birds? I'm curious. Whole bunch of people. This has got to be the most successful propaganda the evolutionary and anti-creationist community has forward on the public at large. I want to take you for a quick walk through some of the different types of dinosaurs. We have the saurischans. The saurischans are called that because they have hips like a lizard. That's where the name comes from, lizard-hipped. The saurischans include ones like the T-Rex and the long necks, the plant eaters, and those and whatnot. Those are the saurischians, named because of the hips. Then we have the ornithischians, named so because they have hips like a bird. This includes dinosaurs like the hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs. Now, if you look carefully, the ornithischians, have hips like a bird. Some of them have beaks like a bird or like ducks, hence the name duck-bill. They have feet, often, that are like birds. They have arms, which many have promoted as being the precursor to wings. T-Rex, for instance, which is a saurischian, has really small arms, virtually insignificant. So if you were to be an evolutionist, which dinosaur would you say the birds evolved from? The saurischians or the ornithischians? Which one makes more sense? The ornithischians. After all, that's why it's named orni, for bird. It's bird-hipped dinosaur. Nevertheless, the common belief is that birds evolved from the saurischians, T-Rex, the long necks, etc. Homology as an argument is nonsense, yet it is always promoted. For example, with the coelacanths, they make analogies between the human hand and the coelacanth fin, or the human hand and bird limbs, whatever. This is called homology. They look at similarities between organisms and say, see, they must have had a common ancestor. The only time they use homology is when it works in their favor. Notice how much they are ignoring all the similarities they are ignoring to promote the idea that saurischians evolved into birds. Homology breaks down, it doesn't work. Now, there are a number of supposed feathered dinosaurs or dinosaurs evolving into birds. Sinosauropteryx prima, I'll give you a couple of these. Some evolutionists, including at least one who does believe that dinosaurs evolved into birds, have argued quite vehemently that the supposed proto-feathers that were found on this fossil are actually just collagen fibers from decaying flesh. Not necessarily feathers at all. This was just, again, repeated just recently. I've forgotten the name of the gentleman. But again, it was repeated with more fervor and more evidence just recently. Caudipteryx jui and Proto-Archaeopteryx. Now, these are another two supposed feathered dinosaurs, half bird, half dinosaur. Other evolutionists have argued these were merely flightless birds. Now, here's the catch. We talked about Archaeopteryx previously. Archaeopteryx was just a bird. Okay? It was around before the dinosaurs that it was supposed to evolve from. This doesn't make any sense. The birds were already around before they were supposed to have evolved. However, Archaeopteryx also appears 30 million years before either of these. Modern birds or flying birds were already around. There's no evolution going on here. It's backwards evolution, if anything. So that doesn't stack up. Archaeopteryx, of course, supposed to be 150 million years old, is predated by two fossils called Proto-Avis, completely modern birds that were found in rocks supposedly 225 million years old. Again, it's backwards. The birds were already there. So how can you say the birds evolved from dinosaurs when the birds were there before the dinosaurs were? It makes no sense. Yet, this has got to be one of the more successful techniques that the anti-creation community has used to promote the idea of evolution to the public at large. And last but least, now, this is important. Again, I want you to think skeptically whenever you see evidence presented for evolution. This was one classic example, Archaeoraptor leononensis. This was a very famous fossil. It was heralded in the newspapers as absolute proof. This puts the final nail in the coffin for anybody who doubts that dinosaurs evolved into birds. This is the proof. Newspapers took it and ran with it. Within a month, feathers flew over the controversy. It turned out the fossil was illegally imported into the U.S. It also turned out that it was a fraud. I'm not saying this to embellish mistakes. I'm simply pointing this out because Archaeoraptor leononensis, I still have people hand that to me as proof of evolution, even though it was demonstrated to be a fraud years ago. This is the effect the media has on the public at large, and how successful they are at convincing people of evolution using fabrications, and nonsense, and presuppositions. Years later, I am still getting told Dinosaurs evolved in birds. There's the proof. By a fraud. Okay. I'm going to sum it all up. I know that's a lot of words. Bear with me for a second. An excellent website, scienceagainshtevolution.org. All one word, Science Against Evolution. I just like the way they put it so much that I just copied and pasted it into my presentation, and I will now read it for you. They sum up the fossil record like so. In other words, evolutionists believe that because the bobcat, cheetah, domestic cat, jaguar, leopard, lion, lynx, ocelot, puma, and tiger are so similar, they all must have evolved from an extinct common ancestor, the missing cat link. They also believe that the missing cat ancestor and the missing bear ancestor and the missing dog ancestor all evolved from a missing carnivore ancestor. The missing carnivore ancestor and the missing rodent ancestor and the missing ancestors of all the other 16 orders all evolved from a missing mammal ancestor. The missing mammal ancestor, the missing fish ancestor, the missing amphibian ancestor, the missing bird ancestor, and the missing reptile ancestor all evolved from the missing vertebrate ancestor, or perhaps the missing bird ancestor evolved from a reptile ancestor, depending on who you ask. And all these missing vertebrate ancestors either evolved from an unknown invertebrate or evolved from the missing common ancestor of vertebrates and invertebrates. Did you catch that? The evolutionary tree has no trunk. There are only leaves on the branches, but I've got no problem, I've got a rescue for the evolutionists. I'm going to propose that right here in the trunk of the tree, we place the duck-billed platypus, because it has parts of every single critter known to mankind today. Okay? Duck-bill like a duck. It's got venom like a snake. It's got a tail like a beaver. It's just, the list goes on and on and on. So I think it's a great candidate for our common ancestor. Anyway, that was a joke, by the way. Okay. Wanted to cover here, this is something I didn't really have any place to put else, or any place else to put it. But it's a fascinating little subject here. The origin of the Chinese characters. Now, the Chinese language and the written language is probably the oldest known to mankind. They are literally thousands of years old. They probably started around the time of the Tower of Babel, which is very interesting. Now, when you take a look at these letters, oh yeah, there we go there, some 4,200 years old, give or take, okay? Now, if you're going to examine this or study this, Dr. Ethel Nelson was the one who originally wrote the book on the subject. She's since then co-authored it with another gentleman, because since she wrote that book about 20 years ago or so, they discovered these oracle bones, or they were called to her attention. The oracle bones are much closer to the original Chinese language, and the argument is much more profound that I'm going to show you here. So the oracle bones are what you want to focus in on if you want to follow up on this. I believe the newest book is called God's Promise to the Chinese. I believe that's the name of the new book. Okay, so basically here's how the Chinese language works. It's simple characters that are combined to make more complex words and concepts. Okay? So we're going to take a look at a case study, basically, of a number of Chinese characters. For example, the word migrate, or the Chinese character for migrate. It's actually composed of 4 letters, or 4 characters. The first one represents great, the second one, division, third one, west, fourth one, walk. Now, interestingly, if the Great Division at Babylon did take place and they left, they would have walked west from where the Tower of Babel is to where they live now. So the word migrate does have some implications. I mean, why would it include west? Why not just, or for that matter, why not just walk? What's with the Great Division west and walk? It makes sense, however, if you read Genesis, which talks about all the cultures and languages living together, and God divided them by dividing their languages. It does make sense in light of Genesis. Huangdi was the first man. Now, Huangdi makes no sense unless you read Genesis, because Huangdi is made up of 2 characters, the garden and a noble man. Why would they have a garden? What's a garden got to do with a man? But if it's the first man, Adam, who was created in the Garden of Eden, suddenly it makes sense. Interestingly, the letter for garden has 4 lines coming through it, which are to represent the 4 rivers emanating out of the Garden of Eden. Now, The first man, here's another one, or first, sorry, the word for first, is actually alive, dust, man. So basically the word first implies that the first man was made alive and was made from dust. Again, these characters make no sense except in the light of Genesis. You read Genesis, it all makes complete sense. So what's going on here? How do these people know this? Now get a load of this. The word for happiness. God plus one plus man in a garden. That's the word for happiness. What on earth? I don't know about you, okay? Sure, I like gardening and all, but I don't know that I would call that like my ultimate happiness, okay? But in the light of Genesis, it makes complete sense. Moving right along. Okay. Now, this is interesting. The word forbidden. 2 trees and a command make up the word forbidden. Why? In the light of Genesis, once again, makes sense. There was 2 trees. Tree of life, tree of good and evil, or a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They were commanded not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It was forbidden to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Once again, the characters make no sense except in the light of Genesis. This is also very interesting. To covet or desire, again, the woman coveted of the 2 trees for what she was forbidden to eat or partake from. Naked, again, I don't know about you, but whenever I see fruit, I just have this passionate drive to rip off all my clothes and run around naked. Okay, I'm only kidding. I don't really do that, honest, okay? But you can see what I'm getting at here. What on earth does fruit have to do with nakedness? Looks really impressive. Get a load of this. I love this. The universe burst into something from absolutely nothing. Zero. Nada. And as it got bigger, it became filled with even more stuff that came from absolutely nowhere. How is that possible? Oh, just ask Alan Guth. His theory of inflation helps explain everything.